I've got something to tell you before everyone leaves. The birthday candles had already burned down to little pools of wax when I found her standing alone on the church hall porch, holding a paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The laughter from our friends drifted through the open door behind us, but out there it felt like the world had become strangely quiet. She had just turned 68, though she still smiled with the same warmth that had greeted every lonely stranger who walked into our volunteer kitchen. For more than 10 years, we'd packed food boxes together, poured coffee for the homeless, and cleaned folding tables long after everyone else had gone home. Somewhere along the way, she had become the first person I wanted to see every Tuesday morning. I looked at her, shook my head with a laugh, and said the words that seemed safe enough. "Whoever marries, you'll be the luckiest man alive." She didn't laugh. She lowered her eyes for a moment, wrapped both hands around the paper cup, and drew one slow breath. When she finally looked back at me, there were tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, not the kind that come from heartbreak, but the kind that come from carrying hope for far too long. "I was hoping," she whispered, "it would be you." I don't remember breathing. I don't remember hearing the music inside anymore. All I remember is staring at the woman who had quietly become the brightest part of my week. While realizing she had been waiting for words, I had never found the courage to say. How could two people spend more than a decade standing side by side, sharing laughter, grief holidays, and ordinary Tuesdays, and still never know they were in love with each other? If you've ever stayed silent because you were afraid the answer might break your heart, then perhaps you'll understand why that single sentence changed the rest of my life. I finally managed to speak. Why didn't you ever tell me?" She smiled through her tears, but before she could answer, I found myself looking back over every year we'd spent together. Every cup of coffee, every volunteer shift, every goodbye that suddenly felt different now. The truth was waiting for me. It had been waiting all along. She answered my question with the gentlest smile I'd ever seen. "Because I thought you were happy with us being just friends." There wasn't a trace of bitterness in her voice that somehow made it hurt even more. Standing there on the porch, I realized that neither of us had lost a chance because we didn't care. We had lost years because we cared too much to risk what we already had. The memories came rushing back all at once. I first met Helen 11 years earlier in the basement of our town's little community church. I'd signed up to help serve breakfast after my daughter gently suggested I needed a reason to leave the house. She was right. Ever since my wife, Margaret, passed away after 38 years of marriage, my world had grown painfully quiet. The house was still full of photographs, but empty of conversation. The television stayed on longer than anyone watched it. Dinner became whatever was easiest to heat up. I had convinced myself that loneliness was simply part of growing old. Helen was already there that first morning, tying on a faded blue apron and laughing with volunteers as if she'd known them forever. Later, I learned she'd spent nearly 7 years caring for her husband through Parkinson's disease before losing him. She understood exhaustion in a way very few people ever could. She handed me a box of canned vegetables and smiled. "You're stacking those upside down." I figured food tastes the same either way. She laughed so hard she nearly dropped the clipboard in her hands. That was our first conversation. It certainly didn't feel like the beginning of another love story. Over the months, volunteering became our routine. Every Tuesday we'd arrive before sunrise to unload donations. She always brought homemade muffins. I always brought coffee. She insisted mine was too strong. I insisted hers was too sweet. Neither of us ever changed. When breakfast ended and the dining hall finally emptied, we'd sit outside with paper cups and watch the town wake up. Sometimes we talked about books. Sometimes about baseball. Sometimes about grandchildren who lived too far away. And sometimes we spoke about the people we'd lost. Those conversations were never dramatic. There were no grand speeches. Just quiet honesty. I still reach for his side of the bed some mornings, she admitted once. I nodded. I still buy 2 movie tickets before I remember. She didn't offer pity. She simply reached across the table and rested her hand over mine for a few seconds. No words, just understanding. It was the first time in years I didn't feel like someone was trying to fix my grief. She simply shared it. Looking back now, I can see that love wasn't arriving like lightning. It was arriving one ordinary Tuesday at a time. It was hidden inside shared grocery lists for the food pantry. Inside afternoons repairing loose shelves in the church kitchen. Inside the way she'd call if I missed a volunteer shift. Inside the extra container of soup she'd casually leave on my porch after learning I'd caught the flu. When my old porch railing came loose, she showed up wearing work gloves before I could even ask for help. When her water heater broke in the middle of winter, I spent an entire Saturday replacing it. Neither of us ever kept score. Helping each other simply became as natural as breathing. Friends in town started teasing us. You two spend more time together than married couples. We'd laugh it off every single time. I'd answer, we're just good friends. Helen would smile and nod. But every now and then, I'd catch something in her eyes that disappeared before I could understand it. Or perhaps, I understood it perfectly. I was simply too afraid to believe it could be meant for me. By then, she had become the person I called whenever something good happened. She was also the first person I wanted to hear from whenever life became difficult. I just never stopped to ask myself why. Because asking that question meant facing another one. After losing Margaret, did I still deserve to fall in love again? Looking back, I can point to a dozen moments when everything could have changed. Not because fate stood in our way, because fear did. The first time was almost 3 years after we met. Our volunteer group had finished serving Thanksgiving meals, and everyone else hurried home to their own families. The fellowship hall was finally quiet. We sat across from each other with 2 slices of leftover pumpkin pie, neither of us in any rush to leave. She smiled and said, "It's nice not spending the day alone." I was thinking the same thing. The conversation drifted comfortably, as it always did. We talked about our children, about old recipes our late spouses used to make, about how strange it felt that holidays became both precious and painful after loss. As I drove home that evening, one thought refused to leave me. You should have asked if she'd like to have dinner again next week. Instead, I convinced myself she was simply grateful for the company. Nothing more. A few months later, our town hosted a free outdoor concert in the park. I found 2 empty lawn chairs near the back and waved her over. We spent the evening listening to old country songs beneath a sky slowly filling with stars. Halfway through one familiar love song, she grew unusually quiet. "I used to dance to this with Robert," she said softly. "I used to dance to this with Margaret." For several moments, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was shared. When the music ended, I almost reached for her hand. Almost. Then I stopped myself. She deserved someone who wasn't still carrying memories of another woman, I thought. What I didn't know was that Helen had reached the very same conclusion about herself. She later told me that she'd watched me staring at the stage that night and quietly decided my heart still belonged entirely to my late wife. Neither of us understood that loving the people we had lost didn't mean we were incapable of loving again. We mistook loyalty for a closed door. Summer brought another missed opportunity. A nearby town hosted an art festival, and one of our friends suggested we all go together. At the last minute, everyone else canceled except the 2 of us. "We could still go," Helen said. "If you'd rather stay home, that's fine." "No, only if you really want to. I don't mind either way." We smiled politely. Neither of us admitted we had been looking forward to spending an entire day together. The trip never happened. It sounds almost ridiculous now. 2 grown adults, both raising families, surviving loss, paying mortgages, facing funerals, and navigating everything life could throw at them. Yet neither of us could manage one honest sentence. The truth is that growing older doesn't always make fear disappear. Sometimes it simply changes its shape. When you're young, you're afraid of embarrassment. When you're older, you're afraid of losing the one friendship that makes the loneliness bearable. That fear kept me quiet. Every Tuesday, I'd look forward to seeing her. Every Friday, I'd think about calling just to hear her voice. Then I put the phone back down. What if she misunderstood? What if she felt uncomfortable? What if she stopped looking at me the way she always had? So I chose silence. Helen was making the same choice. She admitted later that she often baked an extra apple pie, hoping I'd stop by after church. When I didn't, she'd wrap up half of it and take it to an elderly neighbor instead. She always saved me my favorite seat during volunteer meetings. If I arrived late, she'd casually wave me over as though the chair beside her had simply remained empty by accident. Whenever I miss a Tuesday because of doctor's appointments or visiting my grandchildren, she'd quietly ask the coordinator if everything was all right before asking me directly. I noticed every one of those things. I simply gave each one the safest possible explanation. She's thoughtful. She's kind to everyone. That's just who Helen is. It never occurred to me that kindness can sometimes be love wearing ordinary clothes. Then came the birthday party. Looking back now, I understand it wasn't my compliment that surprised her. It was a realization that after all those years, I still believed I was talking about someone else. And perhaps that was the moment she finally decided that living with rejection would hurt less than living with another year of silence. She looked at me for a long moment before answering. Because I thought you were happy with us being just friends. Her voice never cracked. She didn't accuse me. She didn't ask why I had waited. She simply told the truth we'd both been living. I leaned against the porch railing and laughed softly, though there wasn't much humor in it. Helen, I spent years convincing myself you only saw me as a friend. She tilted her head. Really, I thought you still needed time after Robert. And I thought you still belonged to Margaret. For a second, we simply stared at one another. Then, almost unbelievably, we both laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because we had just discovered that the greatest obstacle in our lives had never existed outside our own imaginations. The party continued inside the church hall, but neither of us noticed. It felt as if the entire world had narrowed to 2 paper cups of cold coffee, and 2 people finally speaking without fear. I can't believe we wasted all this time, I admitted. She smiled gently. Maybe we weren't wasting it. What do you mean? I think we were learning to trust each other first. I let those words settle. Perhaps she was right. After losing the people we'd built our lives with, neither of us had been looking for romance. We had been looking for solid ground. Love had arrived quietly while we were rebuilding ourselves. I need to tell you something, she said. I nodded. Every Tuesday, I make an extra blueberry muffin. I laughed. I know, you always brought 2. The second one was for you. I thought you simply baked too many. She shook her head with a smile. I learned years ago that blueberry was your favorite. Another memory surfaced. The scarf you knitted for me. You lost yours during the food drive. I thought everyone received one. You were the only one. I rubbed my forehead. How did I miss all of this? You weren't looking for it. She was right again. I remembered the winter I caught pneumonia. For nearly 2 weeks, someone left homemade soup on my porch every evening. There was never a note, just warm containers tucked inside an old insulated bag. I had thanked the church volunteers as a group because I assumed they had taken turns helping. Helen smiled before I even asked. Yes. You. Every night. You drove across town in the snow? I didn't want you eating canned soup for 2 weeks. Emotion caught in my throat. I never knew. I know. There were so many moments like that. The seat she always saved beside her during meetings. The phone calls that always came if I missed volunteering. The extra slice of pie she insisted she couldn't finish. The birthday cards that somehow remembered every small milestone my own memory had begun to forget. Each one had been a quiet way of saying, "You matter to me." I thought I was being obvious, she admitted with a shy laugh. I thought I was protecting our friendship. And I thought the same thing. We had spent years speaking the language of kindness, while neither of us dared speak the language of love. The silence suddenly seemed almost unbelievable. Yet I knew exactly why it had happened. When you've buried the love of your life once, opening your heart again feels less like taking a chance and more like standing at the edge of another possible heartbreak. You don't fear being laughed at. You fear surviving another goodbye. "I have to ask you something," I said quietly. She waited. All those times people teased us. She smiled before I finished. I hoped one day they'd stop teasing and start congratulating. I couldn't help smiling. "I should have asked you to dinner years ago." "You almost did." "I know. At Thanksgiving." I stared at her. "You knew?" "You looked at me 3 different times before deciding not to ask." "I thought I hid it." "You've never hidden your heart very well." I laughed so hard I had to wipe my eyes. "And the concert?" "I almost held your hand." "So did I." "The art festival?" "I wanted to spend the whole day with you. I had already picked out which bakery I wanted us to visit." Every missed opportunity became another thread in the same story. Not a story about regret. A story about 2 frightened people slowly discovering that love had been patient enough to wait for them. The church door opened behind us as our friends began saying their goodbyes. Someone called Helen's name. She answered that she'd be inside in a minute. Then we were alone again. I took one careful step toward her. "Helen." "Yes." For years I kept telling myself I'd already had my one great love. She reached for my hand. And now I closed my fingers around hers. Now I think the heart is bigger than I ever gave it credit for. A tear slipped down her cheek. "So," I drew one deep breath, "if you're still hoping." She searched my face without saying a word. "I'd like it to be me too." She covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. For a moment she couldn't speak. Then she nodded once. I've been hoping for that answer for a very long time. For the first time in years, neither of us was afraid of tomorrow. The future we thought had already passed us but had quietly been waiting, just one honest sentence away. The weeks that followed felt wonderfully ordinary. There were no dramatic declarations in front of crowds. No expensive vacations. No grand attempts to make up for the years we thought we'd lost. Instead, we simply began living the life that had quietly been waiting for us. Every Tuesday morning, I still picked her up for volunteer work. The only difference was that when she climbed into the truck, she no longer sat with careful distance between us. She reached for my hand before I even started the engine. It felt so natural that I often caught myself wondering why we had ever been afraid. Our friends noticed immediately. Mrs. Dawson, who had been teasing us for years, folded her arms and grinned. "Well, took you too long enough." The whole kitchen burst into laughter. For once, neither of us denied anything. Helen simply looked at me and smiled. I smiled back. That answer seemed to satisfy everyone. Not long after that, I invited her to dinner. Not because I had finally gathered enough courage. Because I had finally stopped believing courage meant never being afraid. It meant speaking anyway. One evening, while we were washing dishes together, I looked across the sink and realized something unexpected. I wasn't comparing Helen to Margaret anymore, and I wasn't replacing Margaret either. The love I'd share with my late wife would always remain one of the greatest blessings of my life. Helen never asked me to erase those memories. She honored them. Sometimes she'd ask me to tell another story about Margaret. Sometimes I'd ask about Robert. We learned something beautiful. Real love isn't threatened by cherished memories. It makes room for them. Months later, surrounded by our children, grandchildren, old friends, and the volunteers who had unknowingly watched our story unfold for more than a decade, we gathered in the same little church where we'd first met. There were no crystal chandeliers, no expensive decorations. Someone placed wildflowers in mason jars along the aisle. The fellowship ladies baked every dessert themselves. The pastor smiled before beginning the ceremony. I believe everyone here has been waiting for this day. The room filled with gentle laughter. When Helen walked toward me, she wasn't carrying roses. She held a small bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked herself that morning because she knew they reminded me of the country roads we'd driven together after volunteer events. Instead of exchanging extravagant gifts, we exchanged three simple things. A worn coffee mug from our Tuesday mornings. The first photograph anyone had ever taken of us while serving breakfast together. And the faded blue volunteer apron Helen had worn the day we met. Those ordinary things told our story far better than diamonds ever could. After the ceremony, my grandson quietly tugged on my sleeve. "Grandpa." "Yeah, I haven't seen you smile this much in a long time." I looked across the room. Helen was laughing with my daughter while helping one of the smaller grandchildren reach the dessert table. For a moment, I thought about all the years I believed the happiest chapters of my life were already behind me. I couldn't have been more wrong. Love had simply arrived differently the second time. Quieter, gentler, patient enough to wait until two wounded hearts were finally ready to trust again. A few evenings later, we sat on the porch of the little house that no longer felt empty. The same two paper cups of coffee rested between us. The sun disappeared behind the trees as the town settled into another peaceful evening. Helen leaned against my shoulder. "You know," she whispered, "I almost gave up hoping." I kissed the top of her head. "I'm awfully glad you didn't." "So am I." Sometimes people ask if I regret all the years we lost. Of course I do. I wish I'd been brave sooner. I wish I'd understood the quiet ways she'd been saying, "I love you." I wish she had known sooner that my heart still had room to love again. But regret isn't the ending of our story. Gratitude is, because not everyone is given another chance to open their heart. We were, and we almost let fear steal it from us. So if you're listening to this while wondering whether it's too late to tell someone how you truly feel, please don't let silence make your decision for you. The truth is, I spent years believing I'd missed my chance at love. But love hadn't disappeared. It had been standing beside me every Tuesday morning, carrying a paper cup of coffee, saving me a seat, and quietly hoping I'd someday find the courage to notice. If this story touched your heart, let it remind you of one simple truth. You are never too old to love. You are never too late to begin again. And sometimes, the person you've been praying for has been walking beside you all along.